Hello and welcome to this EGR podcast. My name is Niamh, Gallagher, Group Head of Content at EGR. And today I am joined by Will Mace. So Will is CEO and co-founder of EQConnect. EQConnect is a data analytics company focused solely on safer gambling, founded almost 3 years ago, specifically to create a solution for what has become known as the single customer view, or SCV. So Will was previously head of Kindred Futures, the strategic innovation arm of Kindred Group. So welcome, Will. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Niamh. Thanks for having me.
No problem at all. So really topical subject lately about single customer view. The Commission have been talking about this for about 2 years now, even describing it as silver bullet of safer gambling. And with the most recent update, seems to have been brought closer, to fruition than ever, with the ICO identifying two possible lawful bases under the UK GDPR that could apply to single customer view. So I suppose just to start, what is the single customer view? Why do you think it's important? And do you think it really is a silver bullet for the industry?
Yeah, I mean, this is hugely timely, as you say, and the Commission seem to be right on top of this very much at the moment. And they have described it as a silver bullet. And, it's a nice phrase, but I think that's probably overplaying it slightly. Gambling disorders are hugely complex and there's no single answer. And to look for one is probably slightly a waste of time. A layered approach to any sort of gambling problem is definitely needed. And that's what the industry has been pursuing for the last several years, as have the treatment and care providers. But the SCV does have a very significant role to play, even if it isn't a silver bullet. I mean, it sort of represents one of the currently missing layers in that layered approach that allows at-risk players who need help. It allows them to avoid or evade the protections that the industry has on offer. At its core, it's a data sharing mechanism to protect at-risk customers wherever they choose to play. And I'm sure there are something like over 200 regulated operators in the UK. And however well-intentioned or however capable a single operator is at detecting the developing risk of a player's harm, and then intervening to try and reduce that risk of harm, if a player can simply go next door digitally and open a new account, or more likely dozens of new accounts, then the efficacy of that first capable, well-intentioned operator is reduced. Their efforts are effectively in vain, and the player is not being effectively protected. And that has all the possible very serious consequences that we're, I guess, aware of. It's important, it's hugely important. It is that missing layer. I think it's a universally held ambition to reduce, ideally to zero, the number of people suffering harm as a result of their gambling, and that's good. I think everyone would agree with that. Gambling is and should be a form of entertainment, not a source of harm. But without an SCV, the going next door problem will remain. And so some people, a small number, will be effectively unprotected and therefore at risk of suffering that significant harm. So an SCV is important. It's good for at-risk players, and it's good for the industry, who are doing a lot, as we know, to reduce the risk of people suffering harm. And they've been effective in that. Certainly if the Commission figures recent Commission figures on those at risk are to be believed. But as the Betting and Gaming Council CEO, Michael Dugar, points out regularly, even one problem gambler is too much, and that there's still a lot more for the industry to do.
Yeah, definitely. So you mentioned, of course, so many licensed operators in the UK alone. What kind of scale, are we talking here? How many people avoid protections by using multiple accounts? And then what would be the impacts of that?
Yeah, so unfortunately, there's no easy or comprehensive answer to this. If you look at the Commission's participation data, which they publish every year, and they look at all gamblers, so social recreational gamblers, obviously, as the majority, they say there is something like, on average, a player will have 3 to 5 online accounts. But that's looking at all gamblers, not specifically at problem gamblers. If you sort of turn to the helpline operators and the treatment providers, anecdotally, they report that dozens and dozens of accounts is absolutely the norm for the gamblers that they encounter and try to help. So the further down the at-risk spectrum you go, the more accounts you're likely to have. I spoke quite recently to a reformed gambler, an ex-Gordon Moody resident, a man named Sean, who had had hundreds and hundreds of accounts in his time as a problem gambler. And he told me that whenever an operator asked where his money to gamble was coming from, or whenever they suggested any sort of restrictions or limits, he would simply move operator and open a new account. He thinks he had an account with every single operator going at some point. And he suffered hugely from his gambling addiction, and he is one of, unfortunately, too many. So the impacts of being able to gamble effectively unprotected in cases like Sean's are enormous.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, really interesting to hear, examples like that as well. So in the ICO sandbox report, it gives a cautious kind of green light to the single customer view. What is a sandbox in this context, do you think? Why have they not given a full green light?
Yeah, so the sandbox is a phrase that's used for many different things, but in this context, it's a service that the ICO offer, and they call it the regulatory sandbox, and they offer it to all businesses and industries who wish to explore concepts, new ideas, where there may be genuine uncertainty around the position with regard to data protection and GDPR. And what they basically do is they provide a lot of data protection experts to work in close collaboration with the business or industry to try and understand if and how the idea can be compliant. And as you can imagine, that's not always a straightforward process. So the Gambling Commission entered the sandbox with the ICO with the SCV concept. And I think that was about a year ago, in December last year, I think. And they did that because they'd had challenges from the Betting and Gaming Council and from the industry at large around the potential legality or otherwise of the SCV. And the question that they posed to the ICO was, is there a lawful basis for an SCV? Or in other words, does GDPR prevent or can it facilitate the sharing of data to reduce, eliminate gambling harms? So yeah, it's a caveated yes from the ICO. It's definitely unequivocal. Basically, they've said an SCV may be okay. There may be a lawful basis for one, which you could argue is helpful or not. But they had to examine a very particular conceptual model, a very specific form of an SCV in order to make a judgment on it. But they were at pains to point out that the SCV could be many things, and the model that the industry have in mind for the SCV might be quite different to the model that they examined in order to produce their judgment. And hence the caveat. And obviously they would want to examine the model that the industry have in mind very closely before being able to give up some less of a caveat, if that makes sense. But what the Commission hoped that the ICO's report will do is, despite the caveat, will remove the perception that the SCV is a clear contravention of GDPR, because that perception was blocking progress. Basically, the industry said, well, until we have a green light or a better steer, then we can't progress because the data protection risks are too high. So that's what the Commission hoped, that the ICO removed that perception and that therefore progress can be made.
Exactly. So it's just the next step. I suppose it brings me on to the next question. That the UKGC note that the SBC could take many forms. It's been described as a dangerous bureaucratic shorthand that will mean different things to different people, and will tie people in knots until defined. I mean, that sounds like quite a big task and just ever expanding. What sort of knots are we seeing? What have you seen so far? How do you think they could be resolved?
It's a good phrase. I like that description of it. Yeah, so as you say, the GC have said it could take many forms, and they've also said it's up for the industry to determine their preferred model, the form it'll take, as long as it meets certain not very clearly specified regulatory outcomes or objectives. And this lack of definition has left a lot of room for speculators and debate. The way I think it's quite helpful to sort of maybe look at it is the SUV concept can be looked at as on a spectrum. At one end of the spectrum, it's really, really basic. And perhaps an operator would pass a very blunt flag saying player X is at risk. No more information than that, or is showing signs of being at risk. And at the other end of the spectrum, something much more sophisticated and useful, an approach maybe that involves sharing data with regard to patterns of play that can then be aggregated in a sort of holistic risk of harm score or view would be derived. So that sort of spectrum, and until we know where on the spectrum the industry is and where the regulator is on the SCV, the sort of the speculation will continue, and the knots will get ever knottier. One of the biggest ones that I think we've encountered, or the industry of commentators have put forward, is that a fatal flaw in the SCV is that operators will be beholden to the risk assessment of any other operator. So let's take, a tier one operator that's invested millions and millions of pounds in a very, very sophisticated monitoring and interaction capability. They clearly would not want to be beholden to the least technically capable operator that hasn't done that. And if that least technically capable operator raised a flag saying, we think player X is showing signs of being at risk, the tier one operator that has made the investment doesn't want to just have to say, oh, well, right, we can't play with that player anymore. So that's one of the dangers of the most basic SCV. And until it's been defined what an SCV is or could be, that perception is real, but a shame, because it means that people will potentially shy away from an SCV when that isn't the model of an SCV that could be most effective. And then there are a lot of other sort of knots as well. Should it include the land-based industry? Should there be a customer-facing view? Should it have financial data in there? And it's really easy to sort of blow this up, to boil the ocean and try and cover every single possibility, which is what some commentators have done. All perfectly good and genuine questions, but they then very quickly say, well, it's going to take years, it's going to cost millions, it's going to be wildly complicated, and that starts being unhelpful. So I think it's sort of better to look at it as maybe as layers of an onion. You sort of start with the core and build that core functionality, test, learn, iterate, the usual sort of development cycle, and then see if there's value in building another or the next layer of the onion, and do that in the same way. But boiling the ocean in terms of scope from sort of day one, is a surefire way to design in failure, or at least a very slow, complicated route to anything that will help.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, yeah, we've heard a lot of kind of opinions on that, and despite all those kind of predicted challenges or conversations that are going on, so you've described the SBC as a golden opportunity for the industry. What makes you say that?
I think for two reasons. I think the impact it could have on the most at risk, those that are most in need of help, and then secondly, for industry reputation, almost. Proving that it's serious by doing more than ever before to address the problem of harm, solving this structural issue in the industry that allows players to bounce from one operator to another and therefore evading any form of protection. The SCV has the potential to be really, really meaningful, and if the industry get on board with it and make it something that is really, really effective, then I think the industry reputation, as well as the at-risk players, will benefit enormously.
Mm-hmm. So it's really only going to be as effective as the amount of operators that join together to make it so. Yes,
in the ideal world, every operator would do it, and the Gambling Commission have certainly talked about at some point making it a license condition, as they did with GamStop, eventually. So I can certainly see it going in that direction, which I think would be right.
Yeah, and do you think the industry will work together on that? I mean, how do you see that kind of playing out?
I'm an optimist, so yes. I sort of have
Me
to
too.
say yes. It won't be easy. There'll be plenty of challenges, differing opinions. Different operators have different capabilities, risk appetites, all of that sort of thing. But none of those differences, I think, are insurmountable. Particularly now the ICO have given it, yes, a caveated green light, and the gambling minister has come out, very publicly and said this is important. Sharing data to reduce harm is important. And I think with the BGC, the Betting and Gaming Council, acting as a coordinating body on it, as they have on a number of other commission challenges over the last year or so, I think the industry can come together on it, and I really hope they do.
Okay, and so just one last question, just because we're running a little bit out of time. How do you see EQConnects' role, in the SBC going forward, and what are your plans?
I see us very much as industry partners on this. We're all EQ people, all industry people. We've worked for a number of both large and smaller operators over the years. So we sort of really get it, where we get the industry perspective, the challenges, the sensitivities. There's definitely no black box solution that can be brought in or repurposed from another industry. The SUV is a unique challenge for what is a fairly unique industry, and so it deserves a bespoke solution. And we have a huge amount of expertise in the SUV concept and the underlying technology. We focused on it, as you said at the beginning, for pretty much exclusively for a little over 2.5 years. And throughout that period, we've been working with the Commission, with the ICO and the Betting and Gaming Council. So we now want to bring that to the wider industry, to design or work with them to design and develop an SUV that really works, really works for the industry, really works for the regulator, and importantly for at-risk players.
Yeah, definitely. So it sounds like busy times ahead. I'm sure we're going to hear a lot more on this topic. But I mean, we could keep carrying on talking about this. As you said, there's so many different opinions and point of views on it. But really interesting. But Will, thanks again for joining. Really delighted to have you with us on the podcast today.
A pleasure. Thank you very much for having me. It's great to talk.
Thank you. Okay, thanks and goodbye.
Bye-bye.